When it comes to fighting games, nothing is more important than controllers. So many choices, so how do you find what's right for you? Personally, I use a banana. Starting off, we have standardized controllers, the ones that come fresh out the box with the purchase of a console. Or don't. These are the most common controllers amongst casuals and pros alike. Starting with the PS5 controller, we have a really nice layout here, something I've come to personally enjoy. The D-pad being where the stick is on other controllers is quite unique. It's fairly big in size, making it comfortable to move your thumb across the pad, which also has a sort of interesting separation between the directions as it isn't visibly one big conjoined piece. Though it does feel a bit mushy, not much resistance or even a click for those who like audible feedback. It's still very responsive and works well for those who don't mind, but I personally like it when things have some sort of feedback, whether it's a noise or some resistance. On another note, the stick feels quite nice. I'm not much of a fan of using the analog stick on standard controllers for playing fighting games, so there isn't much I can say here other than the fact that it does its job. The buttons feel really nice, bumpers and triggers all do their job, and what I just said applies to the next two controllers as well. Next up, we have the Xbox controller. While the D-pad placement isn't to my preference, the design of it easily makes up for it. It feels incredible, miles better than a PS5 D-pad. The circular design makes it so much easier to perform any sort of motion input, and gliding across it is one hell of a treat. It also has that clickiness that was a turnoff for me in the PS5 controller. Same as the PS5's DualSense though, I can't say much about the stick when it comes to fighting games specifically, but it's about the same, does the job, just not my preferable input method. Finally, the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller, probably the weakest of the three. The analog stick is the same as always, does the job, feels good, but the D-pad is the biggest hit or miss. You either like it or you hate it. It feels nice, but it certainly is quite small when you look at it compared to the others. But it also has that little bit of resistance I like. Overall, the D-pad isn't that bad if you choose to also ignore the Pro Controller's lack of D-pad pivot, meaning you can kinda just mush all the directions at once. In the end though, a good player can make any of these controllers work. All it takes is practice and using whichever one is most to your liking. Overall, the PS5 has a sizable D-pad in a great position that provides comfort, though it lacks any sort of notable feedback for those who like that sort of thing. And it's also worth noting the controller has a battery life of 12 to 15 hours. The Xbox has the best D-pad by far with an audible click, but a position that I don't but you may prefer, with a battery life dependent on the batteries you use, or up to 40 hours if you have an Elite, which I don't. Then there's the Switch Pro Controller. I mean, if you prefer using sticks over D-pads, it's great and also has a battery life of 40 hours. Other than that, it's just kinda there. Keeping on the topic of Nintendo, I want to quickly go over two more controllers they've made, starting with... the Joy-Cons. They're, well, they exist. Primarily, you'll see Joy-Cons be used by casuals in Smash, and rarely in more traditional fighting games. The stick is short and stubby, but it works really well for what it is, though it does of course suffer from the very well documented and widely feared Joy-Con drift. There is something I want to highlight here though. The D-pad. It just isn't it. The D-pad is made of 4 separate buttons, making any sort of gliding through inputs almost impossible. Obviously, it's designed for its purpose of being turned to the side for quick multiplayer, but if you ever catch anyone unironically using the Joy-Cons like this in a game like Street Fighter, it's probably safe to assume you have 7 days to live. The Joy-Cons aren't all that bad though. The fact they're built in this way means you can hold them separate from each other in a more ergonomic way that opposes holding a standard controller all cramped up like this. While small, all the buttons do work very well and have a neat subtle click to them for feedback. The GameCube controller. It is true beauty. At least when it comes to playing platform fighters like Smash. I mean, look at it. You ain't winning an EVO championship for Street Fighter with this thing anytime soon. Someone crazy is gonna prove me wrong in some sort of way, aren't they? So clearly this controller lives its days being used in Smash and literally any other platform fighter. Both sticks feel incredible, easily benefiting from the 8 notches on the rim that help in hitting specific directions. The D-pad obviously just serves its purpose for taunting, and the radio button layout is immaculate for Smash Bros.'s default control scheme. The analog triggers also feel insanely satisfying to mess around with, and the clickiness of the Z button is music to my ears. Moving back on track to more universal controllers though, we have the iconic arcade stick. Ignore those for now. Fighting games were born in the arcade era, meaning that when it came to controls, they had to be designed around the most common form of movement input, the joystick. This thing is a beauty, allowing you to use the full effects of your arm and wrist to input your motions. The joystick itself has 2 types of gates, square being the default on most sticks, and octo being the optional purchase. My personal preference is square, and as you see here, when I move the stick, it doesn't move in a circular motion, it more so hits very specific angles in the square. An octogate is something those who use a GameCube controller should be familiar with. The shape itself is more or less the way the notches on a GameCube controller are, meaning the stick of course moves in a more circular rotation. As for buttons, having every attack you need all on one overall face is extremely convenient instead of having to spread your attacks across 4 phase buttons and a few bumpers and triggers. An arcade stick controller is quite old school, but the learning curve is quite high as arcade stick layouts aren't as common or readily available nowadays, especially in the US where arcades are few and far between. One final bonus of a controller like this is its customizability. Whether it's just button and stick colors or even full-blown art, these things let you express yourself on a whole nother level. Now back to those extra buttons I told you to ignore earlier. Those are a simple button-only alternative to what a joystick does. These types of controllers are known as cheap all-button controllers. Why'd I say all button? Because there's different brands that make these. Hitbox, Snackbox, Smashbox. I didn't have it in the budget, but I will make a follow-up video because there are definitely a lot more control options than what I present in this video. Anyways, what I said about these buttons over here earlier still apply, but now we have this other set of buttons related to movement. In order from left to right, what these buttons do are move left, down, right, and up. This type of layout has an interesting learning curve, as it's quite an alien button format in fighting games. Having buttons for movement can be quite advantageous though, as you can do stuff like this in Street Fighter. Yeah, cheap box, I get it. So far though, this has to be my favorite controller by far. And I'm not referring to the shortcuts, I'm referring to the button-only nature of the controller. It feels really ergonomic and easy on the hands for some people. Next up, fight pads. The one I hold here specifically is the Hori Fighting Commander Octa. Why? Well, it's cheap, and I needed one for this video, but cheap doesn't necessarily mean bad, even though I do have my own personal gripes with this controller. The D-pad has that same circular style shape as the Xbox controller with a position more akin to that of a PlayStation layout, which you'd think I'd love this, but my main gripe is that the D-pad feels really mushy. It still does the job and quite well at that, but the mushiness is just something I can't personally look over. As for the analog stick, holy shit, it has GameCube notches. Now, while the D-pad has its issues, the stick is about as you'd expect, even being on par with the more standard controller, but having the notches here makes it a lot more preferable, and aids in holding specific directions. The stick being this good only slightly makes up for the average feeling D-pad though. As for button layout, you'll see it has a more arcade stick style to it, having the right bumper and trigger on the same area as the 4 standardized buttons. Easily you can tell this controller was made with 6-button fighting games like Street Fighter primarily in mind, and it does feel great to use. For those that prefer a D-pad or a GameCube stick over a joystick but love the more convenient button layout of an arcade stick, this is quite a formidable combo of a controller, possibly being your best choice. There is one last fighting game input method to go over, and unless you're a mobile viewer, you might be using this input method right now. That's right, keyboards, with access to either a WASD ASD spacebar layout, or literally any other cursed layout you can think of. A keyboard can be used with any sort of mapping, making it highly customizable when it comes to your personal preference of what key does what. In Street Fighter, for example, if I aim to use a keyboard, I personally use this layout right here. While it isn't the most pretty thing to look at, I can say that when deciding to switch the hitbox, I did use a keyboard to learn the layout so I could more easily decide whether or not to make the purchase. For those of you who like using the WASD keys but want to upgrade from using these small keys to attack, there's a controller known as the Mixbox, which uses keyboard keys for movement and standard arcade stick buttons for everything else. If you want to upgrade the WASD keys as well, you could also get yourself something more similar to what you see on my own stick. In the end, what control method you choose comes down to what makes you feel most comfortable and optimal. And hey, if you're at a local and see someone with a controller you've never used before, or maybe you're thinking of switching to it, don't be afraid to politely ask for a test run. Never be afraid to try something new, and hey, maybe you'll like it. This is Silver, thank you for watching, and always remember to blame the lag.